Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to our Smart VR fireside chat on the topic of VR therapeutics, specifically addressing pain and anxiety through virtual experiences. This event is hosted by the Smart VR Center, which is funded by the USC Office of Research. To learn more about our center and events, see our website at smartvr.usc.edu or follow us on Twitter at USC_SmartVR. Today we are joined by Josh Sackman, co-founder and president of AppliedVR, along with Aaron Gani, founder and CEO of BehaVR. Co-hosting this event will be Marientina Gotsis, USC Creative Media and Behavioral Health Center Director and USC Smart VR Co-Director, as well as Vangelis Lympouridis, who serves as adjunct faculty within the USC Viterbi School of Engineering. And with that, I will hand it over to you all and we can begin.
Great.
Thank you so much, Julie. Marientina, do you want to post the link for a little board that we are going to maintain?
Yeah, why don't you post the one with the right permissions for our audience?
Let me do that.
And
so we'll try to maintain an online
notes, basically.
Notes, for those that don't know, to make it easier to capture some of this information that we're going to unfold today, and also put a more clear path to our discussion. So we'll begin with the framing. Smart VR is a center that emphasizes transdisciplinarity across the different departments interested in using VR for health and care medical applications. So today we would like to take a student perspective, an informal group of students about what is happening at the industry and how we see a whole emerging ecosystem. Therefore, we invited Aaron and Josh, two thought leaders and leaders in the startup community in VR Therapeutics, specifically for mental health and behavioral health. And we'll take a specific angle to discuss about the ecosystem that is emerging, and then how academia can help, how we can transfer knowledge and prepare the future of workforce needed to get this done in the right way, where everyone helps each other and supports this really strong thesis that VR can offer diagnostic and therapeutic tools for mental health and behavioral health. So, Marientina.
All right. Josh, I hope you don't mind, going to start with you and say that, well, you started pretty early as a visionary entrepreneur in this field of VR therapeutics, and you're primarily focused on mental and behavioral health. So why don't you let us know, let all of our audience, I of course know part of this, the mission and vision of your company, and what exactly is the first round of products that you are bringing to the market?
Sure. So AppliedVR is a digital therapeutics company using virtual reality as a modality for treatment of chronic pain. Long term, there's certainly a lot more applications beyond pain. However, it's a pretty substantial problem with roughly 1/3 of the US and 10% of the global population afflicted with chronic pain. Our first product is EaseVRX. It's an 8-week treatment program that's skills-based, meaning it's not just about immersive distraction or helping when people are experiencing pain, but ultimately leads to transferability of skills. So when the goggles come off, people are more equipped to be able to deal with pain, not only reducing pain, but improving their quality of life. We received breakthrough therapy designation by the FDA last year, and we've leveraged that to really advance our regulatory pathway with EaseVRX. We actually submitted our de novo filing last month, and our hope and our vision is to make therapeutic virtual reality part of the standard of care for chronic pain treatment. So typically in our experience as a pioneer, virtual reality is one of the last things that doctors have been trying to help with their patients, where they've exhausted all of their options. And it's become one of those things, well, why not try it? It's low risk and we've tried everything else. when in reality, it should be one of the first things pretty far upstream because it's highly effective and very low risk. And so it should really be part of conservative care. And so that's really our mission, is to establish virtual reality as part of the standard of care. And part of how we're doing that is to make it prescribable and reimbursable, so it gets consumed just like other types of treatments, medications, and devices within healthcare. So that's a little summary.
All right. And Aaron, of course, trailing not too far behind, making a leap from Humana, you've started your company. So what is your mission and vision, and what are you planning to bring to the market right now?
Yeah, it's nice to be with you all today. So our mission is really about transforming access to behavioral health care. And so I was at Humana for 12 years, and through all of my smart colleagues there, became aware of this meta comorbidity of behavioral health. You know, so many people suffer with undiagnosed or unmanaged behavioral health conditions. And coming from a payer background, what I saw is that, you know, we're spending 85% of our $4 trillion a year in the US on chronic disease. And if you look at a group of people for a given level of chronic disease burden, if they also have unmanaged or undiagnosed behavioral health concerns, they do they're much worse off, and we spend a lot more money on keeping them healthy or trying to keep them healthy. And so that was the problem that we set out to solve with behavior. That was sort of the problem side. The solution side was to use the power of virtual reality and the unique neurological attributes of VR to change how we bring people into a digital experience, use the diagnostic power of the medium to ultimately inform the therapeutic power of the medium as well. And so it's funny, our first product that we took to market is a program to focus on chronic pain. And so we intersect very squarely with AppliedVR, which is no fun, let me tell you, because those guys are so good and they execute so well, and they've got such great data. And so I can't tell you, every week somebody says, "Hey, have you heard about AppliedVR?" And I have to say, I have, actually, yes. They're a great team and a great company. What I love about working in this space, though, with other companies like AppliedVR is, you know, we need more and more awareness to be built about the power of this medium. You know, this is not just, well, gosh, why would you do VR if we've got all this stuff on smartphones? VR is unique in terms of how our brains process it. And so we are addressing behavioral health broadly with a core around stress, anxiety, and exposure and extinction. We've got a range of general wellness products in the market today, the most mature and first of those being our pain neuroscience education program. And we have a partnership with a pharmaceutical company who's also a co-owner of our company to work on our first FDA cleared digital therapeutic, which will be targeting social anxiety as well.
Great.
Excellent. Marientina.
Well, I have my next question for Josh, which is, what is the outline of your startup journey so far, being in place for a little bit longer than BehaVR?
Yeah, so when I started doing this, it was 2014, just a little before Facebook acquired Oculus. And so the landscape has obviously changed quite a bit since then. And, you know, given the topic of this is kind of partnering and working with academia and kind of where opportunities lie, leveraging resources and leveraging partnerships, you know, one of the first observations that we had early on when we saw there were 2 decades of experience just in acute pain management and VR alone, you know, going back to early to mid 90s with Hunter Hoffman's work and all the research that spawned from there. It was shocking to me how much great research and innovation exists within the silo of academia and rarely leaves a laboratory environment, because there's so many things it takes to actually take research and the design principles and take those learnings and actually productize them, figure out operational models, figure out business models. And, you know, there's so much opportunity within that. Being an innovator isn't just coming up with new ideas and new ways of doing things, but it's actually the translation often of existing ideas and proven principles into ways that actually make it practical to use in the real world. And that was the early thesis, is what if we could take these principles that really have a lot of evidence that show they should work in the real world, test and prove they could actually be consumed outside of a very controlled kind of scientific environment, and figure out, how can we create market demand? How can we make these accessible and easy to use? How can we create, the business models and structures to actually operationalize these in the real world? And so that's where we started. We followed the existing research and developed a product that was designed to be used before, during, after painful procedures, leveraging distraction games and relaxation principles and other things that had already been proven, but put it on a Samsung Gear VR at the time, which was far from the most, the best experience from a VR headset, but it was untethered and it was good enough to actually prove that there's some utility in the real world. And it quickly evolved from there as we got the learnings from deploying in a couple dozen to now, around 250 hospitals that we deployed in. We learned so much around how you clean it, how you train the staff, how you explain it to a patient and set the expectations up front, how you create a good operating system so you can navigate it without a lot of friction, because friction is a really big issue with VR as you actually make it easy and accessible to use. And that's where we got the learnings of, okay, if you want to put this in the home and you want to address these massive behavioral and mental health issues, helping in a clinical setting offers tons of value, but the biggest gaps in our healthcare system aren't necessarily treatment options when you're in the hospital. There's lots of options of how to help a patient in the hospital. But when they're discharged or they're dealing with a chronic disease in the home, patients often are left with with little options outside of pharmaceuticals and very traditional options. And that's where digital therapeutics and the scalability of them really have an opportunity to influence outcomes and help patients live better lives. And so if not for those academic research insights that got us into that hospital environment, that got us into translating that into home care, we wouldn't be at this place that we are now, I guess, around 6 years later. So that's kind of the journey we've seen, with a lot of support with academic partners and industry partners to help advance us along each step in that journey.
Well, we certainly like to hear more about the partnerships, and we'll talk about that in later today. Aaron, I know your journey is slightly different, obviously. How would you describe it?
Well, it's pretty similar, actually, in many dimensions. In terms of being a part of let's call it a nascent industry that has this unique advantage of maybe 20 years of prior research that says this stuff ought to work. That's kind of cool. We don't have to take a huge leap in terms of the belief in the fundamental approach. But, as Josh said, there's all sorts of things to be worked out regarding various frictions in the market, right? So on the one hand, you have to create a great consumer experience and or clinician experience to the extent they're involved. But if you get the science right, the product right, the clinician and patient experience right, you still have all the complexities of healthcare and all of the competing and often conflicting incentive structures in healthcare, and you got to get paid. And so much of our healthcare in the U.S., of course, we're not accustomed to paying for our healthcare out of pocket, and so it's a challenging space in the sense that you have to be willing to take on a very complex industry, healthcare. You got to be willing to be a pioneer in the attempt to scale up in a very consumer grade kind of way this medium of virtual reality. And we're playing in the space of digital health and digital therapeutics, where there are business model sort of theses out there, but they aren't quite proven out yet, right? So even the very name brand digital therapeutics firms, let's say Pear Therapeutics or Achilles or Applied, it's like we are not yet at the point where it's obvious that the reimbursement is going to happen. There's a lot of signals. There's a lot of sort of, you can see the pathway, but it's all still fairly nascent. And so it's a thrilling place to be, because the potential to reach millions of people and transform care pathways is tremendous. We're literally creating sort of a sub-industry here, which is fantastic. it's also a bit of a thrill ride in the sense that you're making big bets and hoping that they're going to work out. But a lot of things have to go your way, from a technology perspective, clinical proof and evidence, demonstrating ROI, and then getting reimbursement structures, regulatory structures. We've got a lot of aligning to do. So it's pretty exciting though when you think about the potential that we have for doing something that is really transformative in terms of the patient or consumer experience, and that's what keeps me excited and back here early at the office every day.
And just to layer on top of that, just one quick reaction is what's pretty awesome is, Aaron and I and the others in the space, we're analyzing the same information, the same industry, and you walk away with different interpretations and different ways of using that to shape your product and your business model and your partnership structures in different ways. And none of those are right or wrong, because as a pioneer, you often find the need for flexibility, and we're constantly learning from each other around what works and what doesn't. And the idea of competition so early, I'm sure some level of it exists, but at the same time, the competition isn't from applied VR versus behavior. It's actually from companies or people not taking that evidence-based approach and putting products or ideas in the market that may discredit the medium. It's not from having multiple companies, because it's such a massive industry that has so much space for multiple companies to succeed. And a lot of what we do ends up being complementary or synergistic long-term in helping enable kind of the path to market. So even if there's multiple products, figuring out reimbursement, figuring out kind of product codes within CMS, figuring out all those types of things, the work we do helps each other more than it hurts each other from a competitive standpoint.
So you've both highlighted some of the, challenges and opportunities. Would you say that there's some current challenges that are sort of top priority in your mind? Either one of you? That are unresolved?
Aaron, do you want to tackle that first?
Yeah, sure, I'll go first. So we described some of the dimensions of the challenge, right? This puzzle that we have to unlock. A lot of people would go to reimbursement as kind of the macro challenge, right? And there's, as I said, there's a lot of indication or signals that we're gonna get there. We're not that far away from that. So setting that aside, for me, I came out of industry, not academia at all, other than being a student. And so for me, the well-worn pathways of, let's call it technology transfer, just to put a simple label on it, out of academia into industry, it was not something that was in my background. And so, there are things that you can hear from people that, if it's new to you, it can sort of bounce off a little bit sometimes, for me anyway. I often describe myself as a slow learner. So for me, there is a challenge still and an opportunity around the 20 years that Josh and I mentioned of prior research in this space, and finding really effective and efficient ways to unlock that know-how and that IP, translate it to the technology capabilities of 2021 and beyond, and bring more value to market faster. I find that it can be sort of frustrating, if that's the right word, when even in 2021, you read time and again about stories where people are sort of, hey, did you know VR could be used for this or for that? And gosh, let's do a pilot. And, when you've been at this a while, you think, man, the time for pilots on some of this stuff is over. You should be doing large scale deployments. But we as companies trying to create products that can really scale up in the market, I think we have work to do in terms of very efficiently unlocking that prior knowledge and sort of IP and getting them into products faster.
Josh, what do you think?
Yeah, I'd say there's, so the first this doesn't apply just to therapeutic virtual reality, but anything within healthcare. If you can gain alignment between patients, providers, payers, and then layer on the fourth P, policymakers, you have a home run. But there's so many misaligned incentives that you're lucky to get 2 or 3 of those parties aligned, which could be problematic, because what's good for patients doesn't necessarily work for the payers because it adds cost, or it interrupts the workflow of the providers, or there's not a clear established regulatory pathway. And so just misalignment of healthcare incentives is a very macro level issue that makes it very challenging to innovate or advance healthcare in general. But beyond that, kind of two kind of gaps in terms of where the evidence stands now that are real threats towards large scale adoption. And one relates heavily to reimbursement, but there's so much clinical evidence. But from the health economic side, we're still very, very early in proving out where can we create value from a business perspective? Where are we saving costs? Where are we creating efficiencies? Where do we have opportunities to drive incremental revenue or additional value in the value chain? Are we creating satisfaction and higher levels of retention between payers and their beneficiaries? Is that where the value is? And so there's tons of these questions that still need to get answered, because from a reimbursement standpoint, as great as it is to create clinical benefits for the patients and to create more options for their providers, if you can't justify the hard ROI of, we're going to spend $10 because we save $30, if you can't articulate that, you end up being pushed in a camp where you're undervalued or it's not clear how you get valued. And then second is, despite having products that work in a clinical research setting, if you don't have demonstrated engagement and adherence from a real world perspective, meaning the product works, but if people don't use it, does it really matter? And so getting real world utilization of a product where it's not through a research protocol and saying, you need to use this 3 times a day, complete these surveys, and there's all these artificial things like study coordinators to keep you on your product. In a real world, you may have some of those roles, but it's ultimately the easy use and design of the product that makes it engaging. And again, from a payer perspective, if patients aren't using the product, that impacts their likelihood of reimbursement. And so the misalignment, the usability and engagement and the health econ are still 3 areas that I know both of our companies are working to advance that. But that's where I think the next 5 years the focus will be for our industry to push things forward.
So Vangelis, I'm gonna pass it back to you for some of the juicier questions here on this ecosystem situation.
Absolutely, and what a perfect segue, Josh and Aaron, to start talking about the health and care ecosystem and the synergies between the stakeholders. I would like to focus more specifically in how academia, as you mentioned before, has this body of knowledge that we need to find a way to transfer and encapsulating products and services that work, that they're evidence-based, then we can run clinical trials, prove the health economics, address the regulatory concerns, and choose whether we go through a regulatory path or not for our products, and somehow create this kind of ecosystem that, as very well Josh said, value is identified, is objectified, we know what we're talking about, and everyone is alignment that the key thing here is access to care, and allow those that need the services to have access to the services, and then the reimbursement. So these companies that are leading the way, like BehaVR and AppliedVR, to survive and thrive in the future. So how do you see this ecosystem working at the moment? And then what will be the ideal flow in that you see? So whoever wants to go first, and we can also, Marientina, open the discussion and provoke and really get into some interesting discussion here, please.
Sure. So, we've had extensive partnerships and collaboration on the academic research side, from work at Children's Hospital Los Angeles and Cedars, and grant-funded research at Geisinger and Cleveland Clinic. And it's really great to have so much invested interest, because not all the research is grant-funded. A lot of the research are internal institutions wanting to advance their own experience and expertise in these areas. And so we've had a lot of tailwinds where it's very rare to be in a startup environment where you're not being asked to fund every study that you're part of. There's so many innovative researchers really looking for partners like with BehaVR's products and AppliedVR's that want to advance the science, and we're able to equip them with validated tools to run rigorous research. And so there's so many synergies there. I think the biggest challenge that we've had, particularly around the last year during COVID though, is academic research institutions offer some of the most rigorous, robust, best resourced research teams to work with, especially as an earlier stage startup. Once we're getting at the stage now, part of one of the challenges is speed. In addition to our partnerships, we've also developed, we have internal PIs and research resources to be able to run our own decentralized trials. And in a world of COVID, that's quite a bit more efficient. While there's tons of design flaws and risk of conflict of interest and bias of internal research teams running our own research, and there are things we do to counterbalance that to hold ourselves accountable for the most rigorous research, we're able to run, from recruitment to publication. We ran a nearly 200-person, double-blinded, placebo-controlled, randomized controlled trial in 6 months from IRB approval to publication. That's unheard of in the academic space. Often that would take closer to 1 to 2 years, often more towards the 2 years mark. And so, one of the challenges as we move forward, and speed matters in innovation. 2 years, just the hardware and the amount of innovation and product development that happens changes drastically. Academic institutions need to evolve so we can have a hybrid model where we're still leveraging the same quality of resources within academic institutions, but there's a little less barriers and a little more kind of speed and dynamics that allow us to be able to achieve some of the same timelines and some of the same kind of innovative research techniques where we can use online recruiting and run decentralized trials across multiple sites to get a national sample, but still without losing the integrity and the quality of having academic research partners.
Since you mentioned, Josh, a lot of times we leverage academic knowledge and all that. Have you faced challenges regarding IP? What this sensitive matter when you have an academic endeavor? There are also individuals, institutions interested in the commercialization of this knowledge and all that. At this moment, I think there's not a friction, but there's a disconnect between identifying academic IP and transferring IP to the industry. So do you see that as a challenge, or do you see that as an opportunity to specify this flow so we better accommodate each other and better accommodate the transfer of knowledge and innovation into the marketplace? The strengths that academia has, strengths that the industry has. Can we work hand to hand?
It's a tricky question. Academic institutions vary so much. Oftentimes, I think the biggest disconnect comes, there's really great researchers out there who want to license their IP and learnings, but there's often these frictions and barriers between the actual tech transfer offices that make it prohibitive for startups, either from cost or timing, to actually extract and integrate that IP. That often you find yourself going through duplicative efforts of trying to recreate those same design principles through your own approach, where you could probably shave off a lot of time and benefit the institutions if they were a little more startup friendly or flexible in terms of how you work with companies and licensing out.
Yeah, I definitely agree with all of what you said. IP transfer is a sore spot for most of academia, including USC, because there isn't enough disciplinary expertise to be able to take advantage of all the different types of things that a large university, especially an R1 university, can create. So there's typically a team of business and legal expertise that is focused on very specific types of products. And this sort of new stuff is impossible to imagine what to do with. And so there's delays, and there isn't like a compassionate release to give companies, let's say, first rights to license, fast track stuff, get it out. and just kind of move it, knowing that a lot of beginnings, fail more frequently anyway. So why be so grabby? From the standpoint of production scale efforts and research, universities should never, ever, ever be doing large research studies, with very few exceptions, because of this time issue. So I'm glad that you now have the infrastructure to be taking care of that, because it is truly very, very slow. What our strengths are R&D. And there's some kind of transitions in between where we do slightly larger studies, but we don't want to run those things either at the university, believe me. Aaron, I don't know what your experience has been with working with universities, but I'm curious if you've encountered some of these issues, possibly while working at Humana, I imagine.
Well, I've certainly encountered these issues while at BehaVR. I would tell you that while at Humana, it was sort of different. When you asked the question, or when V asked the question a few minutes ago about the ecosystem, when I think across providers, investors, academia, payers, regulators, it's not an ecosystem. It's a bunch of sort of ecosystems in their own right. There's a lot of work to integrate perspective on, IP and prior research productized. There's the sort of need to demonstrate clinical efficacy, as we talked about. There's the and safety, of course. And then there's a very different question, as Josh mentioned, around health economics, right? And so from a payer perspective, payers care a lot less about our level of sort of regulatory blessing, right, and FDA clearance, and much more about, does this work? Does it drive outcomes? Does it drive savings? And so I haven't given this a great deal of thought, but I'm not sure that there are two parties further apart on the spectrum than payers and academia, right? They're just in very different mindsets. Payers are not looking for new things to pay for. They're looking for outcomes and savings. At the other end of the spectrum is just the science of the thing, right? What is this, and how do we know? How do we know this is actually better for our brains or body? And so, I assume some of the attendees today have an interest in, entrepreneurship, and maybe they've got some IP in mind that they want to go out and create a company around. My perspective is you've got to follow your own path and knit these constituencies together in a way that sort of recognizes who they are and what they care about, but stays true to your own vision. Josh said something earlier, I can't quote him directly, but sort of we watch each other and other companies in the space, but we all have sort of our own perspective about what the right path is. And when you come to understand those, it's evident, like, we don't know who's right. Hopefully many of us are right, but you have to stay aligned with your own vision of how you're ultimately creating value. It is not as simple as following some cookbook about, it's about tech transfer, or it's about a regulatory path, or it's about a reimbursement framework. Those are just building blocks. And the people behind each of those aren't necessarily in alignment and don't see the world the same way.
Yeah, even within, our industry, which is academia, plus even on the outside, right? Vangelis and I talk about the lack of regulatory alignment, even, within our institution. So, there's engineering, and there's the medical school, and then there's a health economics center. And some people collaborate between them, but devices, separate. Pharmacy, separate. Medical innovation, separate. And behavioral economics, separate. And there's a lot of efforts to bring them together, often around grants and other things. But it's hard enough to get those people to talk together about stuff that has already been established for a long time. To talk about, VR therapeutics with all of these bodies requires a whole level of internal education. Just like you're struggling with consumer education, we're struggling with expert education. These are very smart people who are outside of their comfort zone when they're encountering these things.
And just to add here that something that is very dear to Marientina, the Creative Media Behavioral Health Center, which is transdisciplinarity. We need to find the processes the vocabularies, the ways that we can first communicate and then work together across disciplines. And that's something that the center has been working actively for the past 15 years, Marientina, now?
Close.
With
Yeah.
various levels of success within academia and outside. I would like to ask Josh a question. You've been recently through this massive effort designing and executing a brilliant clinical trial. We've read the outcomes, and some impressive numbers were there, but also what was interesting was the design of this clinical trial. What I want to see is like to what degree these trials are heavily inspired by existing models that the pharma industry put together versus thinking outside the box and define clinical trials for digital therapeutics, in particular, what we're talking about, VR therapeutics, that have their own way of proving efficacy rather than having mixed bags like, oh, what did we do for this pharmacological agent? Probably needs to be some adaptive way of that. In my mind, I see, disparities there and a lot of confusion over how these clinical trials should be designed to begin with, and then how to interpret the data, especially as we're talking scale and we're talking digital complexities here. What has been your experience?
Yeah, you kind of have to leverage so you have this interesting, especially in pain and other spaces, you have these established frameworks and methodologies that you can't eschew completely because the clinical endpoints, the study design principles, how it's controlled and randomized is the filter that the regulators, that the payers, that the physicians are looking. So if you introduce something so foreign and so innovative, it's really hard to be able to assess and analyze and figure out, can I accept this data and can I accept the results coming from this newly designed study and actually use it to compare against the other options I have in the mix. But at the same time, the very traditional techniques, to your point, don't necessarily translate well to in-home, self-administered research environments. And so you kind of have to, and USC is a great example, the diversity matters. Having diverse team members from different backgrounds, some representing the establishment and the tradition, and some representing kind of pushing the boundaries and thinking through new paradigms of R&D, coming together to gain alignment and kind of verifying with those various stakeholders, saying, we're going to do this differently. However, some of these clinical endpoints or some of these design, clinical design principles may be familiar to you. If we share this information coming out of this study, is it going to be useful? And so kind of challenging some of those assumptions and validating some of those ideas early on have been extremely helpful. However, digital therapeutics is very different than something molecular like a pharmaceutical drug or traditional medical devices. And so it does require different approaches. And so we've brought on, Dr. Beth Darnall from Stanford, who's done both traditional and in-home research around pain psychology. And so we leverage her expertise. But then we have new doctorate, graduates like Laura Garcia, who I think is on, who obviously, and who's on this as well, who bring new approaches from her research in terms of, studying VR-based therapy models throughout her thesis and PhD, to a number of other experts in between. And so you have people across a bunch of different spectrums of experience coming together to discuss and figure out what's the right path forward. And so I think I answered the question, but it depends is really the synthesized version of, you kind of need to factor in both perspectives.
Absolutely, thank you so much. And before we jump into the regulators that I left at the end, and it's a very important and interesting subset of the ecosystem. Aaron, can you but drill a little bit more at the payers, since you come from that angle in your previous professional kind of endeavors, and let us know a little bit more of how you're thinking of the payers, or how the payers are thinking in general, to try and understand and bridge the gap between the other members of the ecosystem, and how this flow could ideally work.
Sure. So payers, as I mentioned, what they spend a whole lot of their time thinking about is how can we understand our members better, intervene in their lives with therapies and/or support services, and how do we get them healthier? Because that saves us money. I mean, that is really at the heart of their business model. Some of the way that they do that, it reflects very poorly on them. Utilization management and making it more difficult to get an authorization for a service. That's sort of the legacy of where they've been. The more progressive payers are thinking much more about analytics, understand that unique member, and give them the support that they need, get them on a more effective, more cost-effective care pathway. So enter digital health. Digital therapeutics or wellness programs are not aligned to the existing things that get reimbursed in our system, right? So today you get services reimbursed, and facility charges, and drugs, and med devices, and so on. And most of what's happening in digital health, particularly in sort of software as medical device, there is no benefit reimbursement category. Now, there are alternative approaches there, and maybe Josh can speak to some of that. I won't do it for him, but there's different ways to think about that space. But generally, a lot of what's happening in digital health and software as medical device, there's multiple problems. Number one, we have to prove efficacy and outcomes. And even if we can convince the payer that we're going to drive an ROI, there is not a framework there where there's a benefit category that they can say, yeah, that's covered. That's in our benefit design, and here's the code. That's the downside. The upside is more progressive payer organizations. They believe the future of this space is value-based care. Now, it's a decades-long shift, but ultimately they want to pay for outcomes. And that's true of, whether it's a bundled payment structure of a service that gets delivered, or a very expensive drug where they will pay more for a better outcome or better management of the patient experience. Or I would argue in digital health, we are better positioned than any other sort of subsector in healthcare to get paid for, at a minimum, engagement and patient-reported outcomes, and probably more objective outcomes as well, pulling in data from medical record systems and EMRs and so on. So I think the future for digital health is really bright, in the sense that we have more visibility into how our products are engaged with, and what kind of interaction they can drive, and how they can drive outcomes. The downside is that for the very near term, we're still waiting on a few key building blocks or structures to fall into place.
Yeah, I have to say that of the years of doing this sort of work educationally, only one of my students has willingly signed on for classes that teach these things outside of the cinema school, of course. So, the two of you are figuring out all these gaps, and there's tremendous opportunity for sort of transdisciplinary and issues regarding emerging technologies that don't really touch the university in a systematic way. There's something organic about it, and it changes. Everything changed this year because of the pandemic. A lot of regulatory stuff changed, and so there needs to be, I think, an opportunity built around that. So I kind of want to transition to ask you quickly, because we're going to go into Q&A. How do you think what kind of training is missing from our students, at least that that you've seen, and students in general from working at companies like yours? Because this is really new stuff, and it takes a big investment to train people to think about these things, very cross-sector issues and transdisciplinary issues.
In one area that we've seen so much success is really you don't need to get all of your learning and training and experience within a university experience. There's tons of great opportunities for partnership, even through internship programs. We've had so many great interns come into Applied VR and really be able to contribute, not just as interns, but as core team members, advancing research, playing really critical research coordinator roles or roles within the R&D organization. And so I think broadening the purview to just figuring out ways to gain experiences alignment that even you can take back towards the university and help advance the projects and programs that you're obviously running through Smart VR and the other endeavors. And I think the more there's kind of a formal pathway and relationships between companies and universities, because often it's the ambitious, proactive students, which I highly encourage. So almost all of the internship opportunities have come from students reaching out saying, I love what you're doing, how can I get involved? That we're rarely kind of proactively promoting and recruiting for an internship program just because there's enough demand. But there's more, the more there's formal channels and kind of surfacing those opportunities for those who might not be thinking about that, may not be reaching out, I think that would offer a tremendous benefit for the collaborations.
And Applied in particular had quite a few from USC, right? Where
a lot
generate the talent and
as many as I could
way.
send. As many as we could send, we sent.
And also Aaron has a couple of USC alumni.
Indeed, that's true.
Yeah, we're broadcasting.
Yes, you know, we have to honor the brand, right? Vangelis, we have only 12 minutes for Q&A. I would like to invite the audience to ask some questions while we invite our guests to say, a little bit about where they see their future and how they're going to define their success.
Before we do that, Marientina, I would like to hear 2 words from you about the MA and the MFA that you are you designed at USC.
Yeah, very, very quickly.
Just to inform the audience that there is effort in academia to provide the talent that is needed.
We do have, because we recognize a lot of these gaps early on. As early as 2015, we have the only program in the United States and worldwide, as far as I know, in media arts, games, and health, which is a cross-divisional cinematic arts degree. And it's 50% research-based and 50% teaching-based. And then within our established terminal MFA degree, we have a games and health specialty. So you can find all that information on our website. But we have very unique students, and they're a lot of them are on their, they've done 2 internships, even during the program, and they're very industrious and come from all walks of life. So we look forward to having more collaborations with startups, especially in this space where the students are in fact highly interested and they're very hungry for experience. So we can transition to your hopes and dreams. My students are my hopes and dreams.
Excellent. Let's. But I know it's a vast topic. We had in mind to discuss about the future, how AI and big data, but also biosensors can play into the ecosystemic potential here for providing behavioral and mental health to the masses. But there's so much we can cover in just about an hour. So let's open to the audience and hear.
We have a question from the audience, from Andy Sacker. Outside of the health industry, how are VR therapeutics perceived by the consumer?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I don't know what therapeutics are outside of the health industry, but I assume what Andy means is for a consumer who doesn't know about any of this stuff we just talked about, what's their willingness and interest level in VR? I'm assuming that's what he's asking. And what we find is there's certainly a segment of the population that's like, I don't know what that is. Doesn't sound like it's for me. It's probably only for gamers. So it can be a little bit of a challenge getting people to embrace the medium. However, once we get them in there, we find pretty uniform levels of sort of amazement, engagement, appreciation, including across age groups. I mean, the data we have from people in their 20s to 80s, there is no correlation in how much they sort of appreciate and would recommend and engage with our programs. So things like that you might expect would be, skewed towards younger people or gamers or whatever. We don't see that in the data. We think that the medium itself is actually pretty unique and that the technology part of it kind of disappears, so there's no buttons and swiping and keyboards and mice and all that. When you're in there, you're just in there. So anyway, so I'd say that it's still early days in terms of consumer awareness, but it's all about getting them in that headset that first time is what we find.
Josh, you have a lot of marketing data. So what can you say about this?
So I agree with everything Aaron shared. What I would add is, especially for chronic pain patients, and I'd imagine so for most chronic disease patients, there's a healthy amount of skepticism of, I'm willing to try this thing. I'm not quite sure it's gonna help me. I'm not quite sure I'm gonna be able to use it. I see the data that it works, but still this seems a little futuristic, or it seems like playing a game, and that may even kind of demean my perception. This is a serious condition I have, and you're introducing breathing and relaxation and educational videos. However, once you get past that, initial skepticism and give someone a chance to actually try it, the people who walk away at the end of the trial are walking away with pretty strong clinical results, really strong levels of satisfaction and a desire to continue using the program. I think at the end of our 2-month-long study, it was like 90% of people wanted to continue and keep using the headset. As a 5 out of 5 definitely would. So, the top box or top 2 box kind of outcomes of wanting to continue after actually going through the program were very high. And the usability, despite a lot of nervousness of, I can't use a smartphone, how am I going to use VR? We actually outperformed on the system usability scale things like an iPhone, which can be intimidating and challenging, especially to older people. That VR, especially the way that BehaVR and AppliedVR treat it, is we try to create a very simple user experience that actually removes a lot of complexities, because you put a headset on and it just kind of works. It's very intuitive that most people don't expect. So dealing with the awareness, first of all, and then the skepticism definitely provides challenges, because you don't necessarily want someone to walk into any therapeutic program with that type of bias. If anything, you want some self-efficacy bias or some happiness bias or other things that this is going to work and I believe it's going to work. And that's where I think there's lots of opportunity for upfront education, awareness building, training, onboarding, as well as educating the doctors and caregivers and other people around them too.
We have a question about gaining physician provider support, and kind of a tag-along question about restrictions related regulations to medical devices. Let's start with the first one in terms of getting buy-in from health professionals.
It's changing fast. I mean, we've been at this since 2016, and every day or week now we have progress that used to be once a quarter a few years ago. The level of awareness, it's not like, what is VR? Why would I care? It's more like, what are you doing in VR? Tell me about that. Tell me about your programs and outcomes and so on. So that said, there's still a ways to go in terms of getting beyond the innovators and early adopters to the early majority. We count on running into the prototypical sort of grouchy chief clinical officer at some point that's sort of like, this is BS until you prove it otherwise. But we're okay with that. So it's coming along. I think generally the providers are getting more and more aware and enthusiastic by the day.
Yeah, the follow-up kind of question about raising awareness is regarding regulatory restrictions about communicating about a medical device. Has that been a barrier?
Yeah, so to touch briefly on it, the early inclination of a lot of startups is to shy away from or figure out how to circumvent the regulations and there's plenty of ways to, act in accordance with, the Cures Act and wellness guidance and other things that you could do in a compliant way. But once you kind of accept that the regulation is there for a reason, it's there to protect the end user, to make sure something is safe and effective, and that what you're saying about your product is actually true, that you're actually marketing the right benefits, that the claims you're making are substantiated, and that it adds a lot of credibility as you think about getting the buy-in from the physicians and from the payers. It ends up being a strength for companies rather than a threat. But what I do encourage is the regulations aren't intuitive. There's a lot of nuance. And so it's really important that you find experts who understand not just the regulatory space, but regulatory as it relates to this growing digital therapeutics movement, and invest the time in consultants. While consultants can be expensive, it ends up saving you tons of money and time downstream. And there's great people out there who really understand the space and are willing to invest the time, even with startup clients.
And here, there's a huge effort coming from the FDA to embrace what is happening in the industry. We have the Digital Health Center of Excellence that they announced a few months ago in the pre-sale program. So, and they're giving a lot of workshops, and they're really open to work with companies at really early stages and go hand to hand to regulation. How do you see FDA responding to the future of VR therapeutics? Do you think they're going to come back and regulate? Last April, they announced that they're not going to go after anyone that provides a digital therapeutic for behavioral and mental health due to COVID. Do you think that will be reversed at some point?
I think that was a temporary sort of marketing authorization due to COVID. What I'm seeing with the FDA is a lot of interest in let's call it XR. There was an event just before everything stopped happening in person at the FDA on that topic that many of us were at. So I think that the FDA is paying attention, and they're still in learning mode, but they'll be giving us more and more guidance about sort of how to align with their clearance pathways. I do think it's worth stating, this is maybe slightly controversial, but I don't think very. Often alignment to sort of FDA pathways and saying we are an FDA cleared digital therapeutic can be presented as the only viable or valuable path. And I think that's a mistake. I think that certain things should go through that pathway. Certainly, if you're going to make claims about diagnosing, treating, curing, et cetera, you need to go through that pathway. But the notion that anything that hasn't is therefore junk is also, I think, dangerous and not useful. There are plenty of non-FDA cleared wellness programs with a lot of evidence-based design and a lot of evidence proving their utility and value. And in fact, back to what payers care about, payers, and not Humana, but other payers I've interacted with, I'll quote one without naming them, said, most digital health companies will go through FDA clearance pathways, and most of them probably shouldn't. So that's a quote from a payer. Now, why would they say that? They say it because, look, it's taking you longer, costing you more money, and it doesn't necessarily matter to them. What matters to them is outcomes and savings. So it's more nuanced than some folks would have you believe, I think.
Completely agree. And if you look at the diabetes prevention space with Livongo and Omada, there's tons of different, business and treatment models. But it starts with understanding the regulatory pathway and then strategically choosing whether, a clearance pathway makes sense or doesn't. And there's plenty of alternate forms. I mean, XR Health has taken a telemedicine model, which couldn't have been better timed with the pandemic. And but it just shows there's no one right way of doing things. However, regardless of your path, you still have to be informed, and it should be a strategic decision rather than coming from just, not knowing and trying to find the easiest path forward.
So I'm very conscious of your, time, but I think all of these things sort of point to the necessity for potentially a follow-up roundtable with some more discussion on the regulatory stuff. And we'll talk to you behind the scenes about this, but I would really love to close this in a timely manner and release you. We will post the recording as soon as it's edited. I would like to thank my co-host and partner in crime on many R&D endeavors, Vangelis Lympouridis, and Josh Sackman for his vision and spirit, and Aaron Gani for his patience and slow learning, which I think is a good strategy, and all of our guests. So thank you very much. And Julie, thank you very much for organizing Smart VR Center and the Provost for supporting us. And hopefully we'll see you soon.
Thank you.